Right, ladies and gentlemen, if we could I start by being in the wonderful and for me completely new experience of welcoming you all to New York University. My name is Burdett. I'm a professor, a visiting professor with this extraordinary title here at NYU. Otherwise, I work with a number of colleagues, including Richard Sennett at the London School of Economics. And as part of my role here at NYU in the Institute of Public Knowledge, I've been asked by Craig Calhoun, the director, by Sam Carter, and by Richard to organize and help structure a series of events during the academic year which engage in the core sort of intellectual discipline that we're interested in, which is understanding cities, and I'll come to that in a moment in more detail. But understanding them in a particular way, which is to try to understand how the built environment, the physical environment, the space that we create around ourselves impacts and relates to the people who live in the spaces that we create or have created over time. So this is a beginning of an intellectual project, which many of the people who are in this room and at the table have been engaged in for some years, but we've decided very much in this occasion to focus on what I would say must be one of the key areas that affects both the form of the city. Actually, can we have the slide on? Do I need to do something here? I've got a slide. There we go. So I said the one theme, the one area which I think affects cities probably more than anything else, also at this moment in time, perhaps somewhere in the late 19th century, similar things were happening, which is the systems of transport, the systems of mobility. And the point I was making was that these systems of transport and mobility have a massive impact, both on the shape of the city itself, but also on the people who live in them. So the theme of this workshop, and we call it a workshop because we hope we can engage with you in the audience as much as the distinguished members of the panel here, is the notion of designing mobility for democracy. In other words, we're trying to look at the issue of urban form and its transport systems in relation to access from different constituencies and different groups who sometimes are included and often excluded by transport systems themselves. We're trying to keep it away from the more technical discussions of these terms, because very few people in this panel are actually well placed to do that. And I think that's probably significant. What I want to do is just introduce how the day will be structured, and then for about 10-15 minutes talk a little bit about some of the themes that, with my colleagues at the London School of Economics and also some of the people here, have been developing in terms of the research on a number of international cities that we've been studying over time. So what I will do in a moment, after having introduced the panel members and explained the structure of the afternoon, suggest that the speakers actually sit in the front row so that you can see the presentation. So you don't need to do what Richard Sennett is doing, which is turn and look the other way. Thanks very much. Now, before I start, I do want to thank a number of people for organizing the event and making extraordinary effort to make this event happen in a relatively short time. And first of all, Craig Calhoun and Sam Carter from the Institute of Public Knowledge for creating this professorship and organizing this event. Jesse Coffey has been really in touch with nearly everyone in this room and has been wonderful at arranging things, as has Marianne Yang, who's a colleague of mine in London, and Richard Sennett, I have to thank you for the original idea of actually arranging an event of this sort. The way we're going to organize the afternoon is basically around three clusters of themes. And for each cluster, we have two speakers. After each of those clusters, we'll have sort of a 10-15 minute chance to have a discussion with you if there are burning questions from the floor. And the first one is on the notion of mobility and democracy. The second will be on the notion of access and integration. Then we will have a coffee break. After that, we will talk about the governance of mobility. And after that final Q&A at around 4:30, we will be joined also by Saskia Sassen from Columbia University, and we will wrap up with a sort of half an hour of the open discussion and reflections, and we wrap up at 5 o'clock. So that very much is the plan as you see it in front of you. So can I suggest to my colleagues, first of all, thank you for coming from across the world. In many cases, I'll introduce you as you all come up to speak, but if you sit at the front and then you can see the screen and the projections. Thanks very much.
We obey you. Whatever you ask.
Thanks so much. For those of us who will be following the conversation on Twitter, there's a hashtag, and that hashtag is Demobility, DEMOBILITY. Thank you.
Thanks for doing that. I thought, therefore, I'd frame the first session and the following discussions by just talking a little bit about the different perspective, perhaps, that one might take on the notion of mobility and urban transport. And I think there's probably very few people in the world who could summarize this better. And in fact, he could have been here were he not running for the mayor of Bogota once again, the third time, and I hope he will be re-elected. Enrique Peñalosa, extraordinarily successful mayor, together with other colleagues in that city, who in a ways provokes a discussion on this debate with this very straightforward quote, that urban transport is a political and not a technical issue. The technical aspects at one level are very simple. Well, some may disagree with that, and we'll talk about it in a moment. But the difficult decisions relate to who is going to benefit from the models adopted. Now, if we take that as a starting point, I think it was significant to us in order to have a rounded discussion on this, even though we are in New York, where there are many important changes that have happened here through the current administration. We'll hear about that from John Urquhart in a moment. I thought it was important that NYU should understand this phrase and this discussion and this distinction in a much wider and much more global context. We all know that the rate of urbanization is fastest and most dramatic in Asia and in Africa, slowing down in South America, and that the cities and metro regions of the global north on the whole are consolidating and thinking about, in fact, how to retrofit systems that were set up about 100, 120 years ago, with, in some cases, extremely innovative transport systems which were aimed and designed to make these cities deal with dramatic growth and deal with the issues of dramatic social inequalities. And I think to do this, we've invited a number of people, therefore, from Africa, of course, from the United States, and a number of us from European cities, to give a perspective of actually what's happening on the ground, and to begin to rethink, actually, how do you describe what transport and mobility is. And I think the first thing which is important, and I will illustrate this with a series of slides on the screen, is that transport is not just in and of itself a way to get from A to B. Transport itself is work. And if you go to the expanding cities of China at the moment, with their very top-down systems of organization, if you spend time in India, as we have with our group at the London School of Economics, this would not be an untypical situation. So for this gentleman, who represents a large number of people, certainly in Asia, the system of movement, the system of getting from A to B, in this case his bicycle, is his work itself. In some cases, it's also where people spend most of the weekdays sleeping. In Africa, as we'll hear in a moment from Edgar Peters, the new democracy, particularly in South Africa, has created a complete change around of the fortunes of many people who've been excluded for political reasons, and the details will be given to us in a moment. But one was struck by the fact that despite the enormous investment that's been made in the political changes there, the system of transport seems to have been nearly left behind. And what you see is that most people who need work, who try to work, can't use public transport because either it doesn't exist or it's too expensive, and therefore use effectively an informal system of minibuses, as they're called, or taxis, as you see here, and queue for hours, spend a lot of money in unsafe and deregulated or unregulated conditions. This is the way they get to work. It's their only access of getting to work. But what is interesting about this is when they do, in fact, connect through these systems of transport and transit, where these vehicles actually come together is the meeting point of the city. This is Times Square, effectively. This is the meeting point of many systems of transport, which then lead to markets, to informal activities, and this famous picture that many of you will recognize by Rem Koolhaas of the bus interchange in Lagos in a way summarizes exactly what this is about. So transport must be seen not only from the point of view of getting people from A to B, yes, a technical issue you could say, relatively easy, but also what happens when people get there. What time of day do they get there, and what are the conditions of that engagement? This leads obviously to a discussion about the form itself of the city. And the debate about compact versus sprawl is something that Diane Sujimura will be talking about when she discusses the rather extraordinary and positive initiatives of Seattle in the context of, let's call, the North American debate about where cities are going. New York City, in that sense, is, of course, an exception. But elsewhere in the world, the more we look at cities, the more the trend is towards this. The endless city, the city without edges, the cities without an external skin. This is Mexico City, but it could be Bangkok, it could be some Asian cities, it could be many other South American cities. Now, what is important about this in terms of the debate about transport is that to get from one of the informal, illegal, unregulated settlements on the fringes of the city to a place of work can take anything up to 4 hours a day. Anything up to 4 hours a day. Which means not only does this mean it's an enormous cost to the economy, which would be the classic way of describing it, but it's enormous cost to the social psychology and economy of the family itself. Think of someone who's, let's say, is a policeman, who spends maybe 6-7 hours a day commuting in this way. What is he going to be like when he's on the job? Will he take corruption in order to do something else which actually reduces that? So these are the implications of transport in terms of social and also, I would call, psychological decisions are dramatic. In Bangkok, it is well known that some children are put in the back of cars in their pajamas at 4 or 5 in the morning. You may have heard me mention this before, because it takes 3 hours to take them to school and are fed on the way back so they can actually socialize, so to speak, with their family. So the choices, in a way, are hard and very real, and they have a lot to do with the shape of the city. So transport is not independent of land use planning, is not independent of notions of social inclusion. Now, if we go back to Mexico City, this is a city which is vast, as you see, where today, and only today, a bottle of mineral water costs more than a bottle of petrol, just about. So people use cars, even at the bottom end of the scale. And therefore, a lot of the investment of the city is actually made into resolving the issue of the car, with modest investment in the public space and public transport of the city. This is how poor people think of the car. It's a protected, very special element which needs to be kept. And I've seen a number of favelas, a number of informal settlements where in a space maybe as long as 1 or 2 of these tables, where 4 or 5 people sleep, the car actually takes the space of some of the beds because they want to keep it safe. That's the only way that they can actually get to work. There is no public transport that can support a city as big as and as widely spread as Mexico City with 22 million people. And in India, where cities are, of course, exploding at an even faster pace, there's another issue, which is the investment of industries, such as Tata Industries, in cheap cars. And what is that going to do? Well, here is Mumbai, which today is roughly 15 million, will become the largest city in the world by 2050, where today roughly 7-8 million people live in slums. Unlikely that that will change. these are the forms of transport, perhaps, that you still see in the city. I'm not being romantic or fetishistic about it. That's what's actually happening. But this is probably another reality. But more interestingly is that the central government is spending an enormous percentage of its city budget in building these urban motorways, cutting across some of the very beautiful bays of the city of Mumbai, which will clearly just become more and more congested as time goes on. And I know that Jerry Frew later will talk about also issues of decision-making and who decides whether to do that rather than do something else as being a critical aspect of transport and city making. São Paulo is yet another example of roughly 14, 15 million people, feels and looks a lot like New York, but actually behind it has now, and this is a statistic from 2 days ago, 14 million people and 7 million cars. So it's half of the population owns a car. So imagine what that would be like for the streets of this city. And something like 14 people a day die from respiratory diseases which are clearly related to this sort of problem. It's not a surprise that the elites actually use helicopters. There's many helicopters in São Paulo, a poor city and a poor country, respect to Japan or the United States. There's many helicopters there, as there are in Tokyo and in New York. And Istanbul is sort of going in a way that way. Now, there are other factors that one has to take into account when talking about public transport. These are not neutral decisions that policy directors, as we have a few today talking to us, take. We all live in a reality which is to do with the market. And there are some big players in this with enormous interests. And Volkswagen, BMW, Daimler, and others produce large amounts of cars which need to be bought. And just look at the share value, which you see on this diagram. What happened with the share value of these three companies on the 20th of January of this year, when Beijing announced that they were going to start restricting their number of registered vehicles a day. How does one deal with these sorts of lobbies over time when you don't have a system of governance which might actually address these questions? So it is not just a technical issue, and I agree with Enrique Peñalosa here, it's a decision. Who decides that Los Angeles should be a city where 80% of the people take private cars to go to work, roughly, and exactly the opposite of another city at the other end of the world, one of the largest today, as I stressed, but one of the most efficient. It also has one of the flattest sort of social demographics anywhere else in the world, and seems to work very well in providing access in Tokyo to most people from any background. So, how can you intervene in conditions which might at first seem impossible? And what are the lessons learned, in a way, for a discussion of this sort? Well, let's just look at Bogota briefly, and then I'll come to London before we open the discussion. Bogota is as large as London, 7 million people, and it's a city which just increases by the day at something like 2 or 3% rate of increase. And when I was there with the mayor of Bogota, he took me to see 2 or 3 things. One is a series of libraries and schools and public squares right in the middle of the city in the poorest areas, designed by incredibly talented designers. As a result of these sorts of interventions, the literacy rate has tripled in the space of 10 years, and that's, of course, the first step up. But in terms of this discussion today, this is what was striking. He took me out to show me the fringes of the city, and then showed me these cycleways going out into the middle of absolutely nowhere. Well, what this was about was basically saying it's the only way he can plan as a mayor to regulate what will be the informal development of the city over time. And what was built was a series of cycleways, which then the informal city, in a way, engulfed. And as a result of that, compared to, as you see, 1998, a very large number of people have started using bicycles to get to work. And as you can see, people are creative in terms of what you do when you give them an opportunity. A key point he made, which I'm sure we'll come back to, is that density is the only way that you can actually make these systems viable at any level. Unless you have co-presence of people in an efficient way, it's very difficult to make any of these systems actually work. And the other dramatic intervention in Bogota is this one. where a large number of these informal bus owners, not unlike the example from South Africa earlier, basically ran a sort of cowboy network competing with one another. And this was replaced, literally in a matter of years, by this dedicated railway bus system called the Transmilenio. Now, without going into the details here, there's a political issue at bay, which is that basically if you go by bus and you can afford the ticket and it's cheap, you get to work 3 times faster than you go by car. That's a choice. People have a choice. And this is the condition that makes the mayor incredibly happy that he's succeeded, with a lot of very significant effects, as you see there, in terms of improving people's health because of air quality. Now, costs are important. I know we're going to come back to this, because the Japanese consortium had proposed that Bogota would solve its transport problems with an underground system, which would have cost hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. You can see there what the figures are roughly per kilometer of construction. And this bus rapid transit system was built as, you know, a fraction of what is there, and therefore if you compare it over 3 years of use per passenger, you get a significant magnitude of difference. And this model is now being implemented elsewhere around the world, including in a city like New Delhi, which has been incredibly radical in transforming the landscape of that city. Now, because of time, I want to just move forward quite quickly and just talk about some important differences in London and New York, which relate not just to the physical aspects of the city itself, but in the way decisions are actually made. And Jerry, I'm sure, will return to this in a moment. If you look at this map, it shows you in blue what central government does, in red what metropolitan government does, and in green the more local level of government. What is missing here is what you would consider in the United States state-level government. And decisions about transport in London are effectively taken by the mayor of London, as you see there at the red level, with a bit of involvement from central government, and then delegating down stairs. In New York, if I have it right, the yellow system is much more dominant. The state level, the state of New York takes strong decisions when it comes to the MTA, so that some of the key decisions about transport in this city, in fact, are not taken by the mayor, leading to a number of difficulties, you know. So what you have in London is that the mayor is responsible for all these things, the London Underground, the rail system, surface transport. It's a very unique situation, and he's totally in charge of that, the whole of that whole system, and the budget and the decision-making process for that. And that's why we were able to actually implement in a very short period of time the congestion charge. It was a risky thing to do, but it's more or less worked. The mayor who's replaced the first mayor, Boris Johnson, replacing Ken Livingstone, has more or less kept to the same system. And what is interesting there is that car use continues to drop. Bus use has actually doubled in the space of 7 years, and cycle use is increasing, to the point that actually what the mayor of London has done is done something that's very difficult for the English, which is to copy the French. So we've actually done our own form of bicycles, known as the Boris bikes, and I hear that New York may be considering a similar model, and it's been incredibly successful. So successful you can't find a place to park the bicycle. So this is some of the situations in London you're actually faced by that. And other interventions are happening, such as Crossrail, a major new transit system across London, which is trying to mimic some of the other continental European models of intervention. Now, let me finish with 2 maps and 1 project, which in a way try to bring us back to the notion of social aspects and transport aspects. This is a map showing the public accessibility level of London. It's a map of London. It shows you in the red the areas that are very well connected. In other words, if you take a bus or you take a transport system of any sort, you're very well connected. And it's generally the central area. There's some spots down at the bottom, some of these sort of outlying areas, which places like Croydon, and some up on the top right, places like Barking and Stratford. Now, just bear that in mind. Think of that map over there, and you can see on the right-hand side, in the east side of the city, there's not very good public transport, and on the fringes of the city, as you would expect, that was also the case. Now, keep in mind that map and overlay it with this map, which is where the most deprived people in London live. This means people with poor levels of education, poor levels of health, etc. And you can see that the worst hit area in terms of poverty of access and poverty of quality of life is that part in the east. The rest sort of balances itself out. This is simply shown by this map, that if you take the Jubilee line, one of the lines of transport for the underground, every stop you take as you go east in London, a man of my age loses a year of life expectancy. It's that severe and that graphic. So the whole plan of the city has been shaped on trying to rebalance the sort of social equality of London, following on from other European examples such as Copenhagen. And the Olympics, and I'm not going to dwell on this, it might be important to bring in at a later moment, is an example of how to use an event, which happens to be an event which happens next year for 2 weeks, the London 2012 Olympics, to invest nearly $15 billion of public money, centrally funded, into an area which has been underfunded for a significant amount of time. And again, without going into details, the point is that in roughly 2 to 10 years, this piece of London, which had little public transport, certainly provided or underprovided in terms of green space and other facilities like health and education and affordable housing, may, I hope, the jury's still out, we haven't got there, actually become certainly a more sustainable piece of the city, but very much based on the notion of transit and transport. Now, turning to the other speakers and the other themes of today, it becomes clear that the way I think we want to try and talk about it is not just at the level of what fancy travel system can you invest in. This is the great Masdar project in Abu Dhabi, which has great assets and qualities about it, but the cost of actually building something like this is extravagant, so much so that even they are not building it. And if the Abu Dhabi government can't build it, I really don't know who. There are more simple systems in Zurich and other places in Europe. They just took a strong decision years ago not to invest in a subway, but to use the good old tram as a system, and we'll hear more about that from Seattle. There are other systems of personal mobility, of cars which shrink and reduce and can be parked nicely. And even here, I think there are some examples that you may have seen. But of course, the key point, and therefore the discussion which ensues from now on, is how do these bigger planning issues, how do these issues of accessibility and inclusion actually affect a city like New York and many other cities we're talking about? So to address that, I'm going to ask two speakers from different parts of the world to address, I would say, quite intriguingly different realities. The first is Edgar Peterson, who is a professor and director of a new but incredibly significant center for the study of the African cities, called the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town. I think he was slightly surprised when I asked him to come and speak about this subject, because he has worked as a social commentator on the core issues of difference and the modalities of social change in the African city, and has written widely about it. So I thought he was exactly the right person to come and do that. He will then be followed by someone who is familiar to you in this room. I haven't met John, but I've worked closely with his colleague, Janet Siddiq Khan. John is the Director of Policy here at the Department of Transportation, but also has a strong affiliation with NYU as an adjunct professor at the Wagner School. So if I could ask first Edgar and then John to make their presentation. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, and want to thank Ricky in the first instance for inviting me. It's always wonderful to come to New York. It's such an incredible visceral experience of urbanity. So it's really nice to be here, even if it's only for 2 days. In fact, as Rick has indicated, this is really not my area. So I'm going to sort of do a Woody Allen and sort of, pretend I'm on the couch and you're the therapists. And we've gone through an incredibly intense period of experimentation in South Africa the last 5 or 6 years around public transport, and we're pretty traumatized at the moment. So I'm going to present you with a couple of dilemmas in the vein of, as Ricky has framed the discussion, and what is interesting about this, and this wasn't really designed in this way, but in working through this and thinking about how to present an impossible amount of information in 20 minutes, I realized that part of the challenge is that we've in fact done a kind of south-to-south learning and incorporation of new technologies, new thinking from the Colombian experience that we've just heard. And this has engendered new sets of problems for us. And it sort of suggests that really we still need to do some more thinking about some of the challenges associated with universal access that is affordable, facilitates a dignified quality of life and an efficient urban system. So I'll talk about my dilemmas in a second. I'll have to obviously contextualize this a little bit because I presume people aren't too familiar with the nuances of the South African urban policy transition. Give a very quick overview of the mobility system, and then really try and tease out in conclusion in a very schematic fashion what some of the conundrums are that we're grappling with and that requires your thoughtful talking cure. So in some ways, the good news is that South Africa is very much part of this wave, this kind of trend that Ricky has sketched. It's bought the gospel, so it thinks public transport is important. It's high on the political agenda. It absolutely agrees it's crucial for democracy, inclusion, sustainability. But even though it's done all of this, and it's codified in law, an integrated transport approach, we've got some very severe problems. And the most significant of this relates to this question of density. And essentially, the Colombian model is not working because the form that we've inherited for all kinds of reasons, colonial, apartheid, neo-apartheid era reasons, means that we are saddled with such low densities and essentially a North American urban form that it makes any kind of cost structure almost impossible. And this is combined with the fact that 35% of our labor force is unemployed. And for young people between the cohort of 15 to 24, that number is above 50%. So in that context of systemic widespread poverty, it is very difficult to come up with a financial framework that makes any kind of intervention viable. Secondly, a new state, whole bunch of new structures, a constitution that has carved out an architecture that makes all of the various built environment functions spread very awkwardly across the 3 levels of government. And it produces all kinds of unintended conflicts and often insoluble confrontations. And then thirdly, the Constitution as well protects private property. And so expropriation is very difficult. And given the legacy of the origins and the production of urban space in the South African context, the inability to intervene in land markets is a fairly fundamental obstacle to make a transport-based democratic inclusionary system possible. And then, of course, culturally, and I love the pic with the locked-up car, I think that this love affair that cuts across class and race and cultural lines with the car, with the idea of the aesthetic that it represents, the status that it represents, the kind of mobilities that it makes possible. So very briefly, some orientation, and I'm going to go very quickly. This is just to give you some parameters to think about. So the country's got 9 provinces, which is coded there, population of 50 million, 14 million households, average household size 3.6, which is well below what would be the average for other African countries. GDP per capita of just over 5,000, but interestingly enough, if you look at the key urban centers, this triples. So in Gauteng, it's $14,000. And this is very significant. This is in the vicinity of countries like Chile, Brazil, and so on. But a very low human development index. And this, of course, pertains to the HIV pandemic that is most severe in South Africa. 12 major cities, 9 metropolitan governments, and a really twisted hybrid quasi-federal system. And this relates back to how the transition was negotiated between the African National Congress as the leading party and the former apartheid government. Some high-level numbers to just really, because at the core of the transportation resolution sits the challenge of dealing with this. Very poor country, despite tremendous wealth. Look at the life expectancy number. This is incredible for a middle-income country. And then a very substantial number of the population on welfare, and unemployment at really severe levels. So this is unemployed. This is not people who are in the informal economy, right? So we've already counted people in the informal economy in the employed number. So these are people that are outside of any kind of economic life. And then, of course, to top it all, one of the worst income distributions in the world, Gini coefficient of 0.68, which is pretty unthinkable. And in the urban areas, the UN Habitat says it goes up to 0.75. Now, part of what sits at the core of this is that urbanization for black people, and just to give you a quick orientation, so the population is 11% white and 89% black. Black population divided between mixed race, people like myself, which is another 10%, and then the rest is indigenous African. And then there's a small group of what we call Indian Asian, which is migrants from India, which is almost statistically insignificant in the total population, it's around 2.5%. So, but black people, because there was a systematic process of preventing urbanization of black people, because cities were for white people, an interesting and really complicated set of issues happened in the 1970s. As deindustrialization started to take off, urbanization happened at the same time, and the state withdrew from any kind of public support for public housing and so on. And so when we got to the political transition in 94, we sat with this insoluble crisis of mass unemployment, informalization, and a regulatory system at all levels of the DNA of the state that structurally excludes and segregates. And I can't go into the detail of that. Recent work that we've done to try and remap the settlement structure of the country produced this particular map. And what it basically, the important point here is that we already significantly urbanized, and the key urban cores is, of course, where the majority of value add in the economy sits, but also a large proportion of the population remains in, if I can find my pointer to work, it's disappeared. Yeah, remains in these yellow areas. And those are what's called former Bantustan. So these is homelands. So the apartheid state had a policy, and that's the small map on top there, had a policy that every ethnic group had to have its own state, its own homeland, right? And this has left an incredible legacy in terms of massive, massive poverty traps. And we've got massive displaced urbanized areas, which are defined as rural by the statistical agency. And there's settlements of often 200,000-300,000 people with no economic activity at all in the middle of nowhere. So at the urban scale, this is Cape Town. What you typically then find is a very extreme bifurcation. So the wealthy people live along the mountain and along the sea edges, and on these two axes. The sort of middle-class, working-class people live here, and the extremely poor people live here. This is where the central business district is, and this is the economic axis of the city. So people on a daily basis commute for 20, 30 kilometers across that particular axis. But what is significant about Cape Town is that whether you're wealthy or poor, you live in these monofunctional living environments. So it is extreme suburbia, right? And public housing has reinforced this over the last 15 years. So when 94 came, there was a particular imaginary that drove urban reform. And this was the idea that the way to get black people into productive economic life was a massive public housing program. Key focus on public transport to facilitate spatial integration, and the idea that through heavily devolved and participatory local governance, get citizen energy and intensivity in. We've got a very developed and sophisticated urban support program. We provide for all people who have an income of less than 3,500 rand, which is divided by 6.6, you get the dollar number, is eligible by right, by law, to a free public house with title, with tenure, right? And then we provide a whole bunch of basic services for free for poor people, and then also on the transport side. And all of this has pretty much happened. The problem is this. This is the distribution of households across the population. So 80% of the population is completely untouched by the market. So the state provides free public housing, and the private market only deals with 10% of the population. So the question is that the only way the state can provide free public housing to all these people is by doing it in places where land is the cheapest, and that's at the edge of the city. So when you see this number, there is no other country in the world that has a record of this scale in terms of public housing, 3.2 million subsidies for poor people. The government has actually built 1.8 million units in the last 15 years. The problem is they look like that, and they're in the wrong places. And all they've done is to raise the social reproductive costs for the poor. And I can go into that. This is an amazing example from Johannesburg. So this is the core of Johannesburg. The wealthy people live in the north. Poor people live in the south. Soweto is over there. This settlement is in the middle of nowhere, in the urban periphery, in 2000 looked like this. In 2006, a public housing facility was built there, and you can see what we're doing. That's all there is. There's no social infrastructure, there's no transportation connection, and so on. But this is about politically delivering on the mandate of free public housing. So to turn to the transportation situation very briefly, the big story here is this blue bar. So in 1975, the minibus taxis that Ricky showed you had 3% market share. Look how that's grown. Today, it's the dominant form of public transportation, and this really is the core of the conundrum of the therapy that I require. A recent survey in Gauteng, where Johannesburg and Pretoria is located, indicated of total public transport use, the minibus taxis now in the yellow account for 95% of all consumption. Okay, bus and rail, which are subsidized by the state, is only 5%. And this is the economic heartland of the country. So this dramatic growth surely has to hold the clues for thinking about the problematic of today. And what's interesting about this is that this particular paratransit system is an informal market response to apartheid spatial engineering, right? So the system is massive. It is unregulated or partially regulated. It's comprised of a whole range of different discrete owners, different kinds of associations, and it is dominated by, obviously, a mafia politics. And if one has to think about how the overall system could work, this diagram illustrates it very well. So if we consider that rail and bus as modalities is, of course, publicly controlled, corporatized as an institutional form, and this is the nature of the system, which accounts for 90% of public transport trips. And you can see the challenge is how do you get this amoeba-like, amorphic dynamic into this system? And what South Africa thought the way to do it is to use the World Cup of 2010 to introduce rapid bus transit systems to generate a new logic and to bring them into the map. And I'll tell you that story very briefly. And slightly contrary to Ricky's point, this diagram, which you can't read, it's too small, indicates all of the policies that have been, if you will, introduced or experimented with since pretty much 1994, almost on an annual basis, at a national and at a state level of government, to try and come to terms with how to deal with the challenge of public transportation. The most important for today are two ideas, that in 1999, the state realized that the only way one can begin to deal with these minibus taxis is to offer an incentive by recapitalization, right? So to say, if you deal with safety questions, you register yourself, you apply for a license, you don't necessarily have to pay tax. We will pay you to scrap these vehicles and ask you to buy a new vehicle with a financing mechanism that makes it affordable to you. It was a disaster because, of course, the government decided that it had to design what this new vehicle had to look like and got it completely wrong. It then, in 2006, introduced this new policy, the Integrated Rapid Public Transport Network Program, at which the centerpiece of this is the Integrated Rapid Transit System. I won't go into the detail of this, but they basically decided they were going to target 12 cities. They were going to treat it as an experiment, use the investment that was being leveraged around the World Cup as the trigger for this, and try and demonstrate that it is possible to think of an integrated modality that incorporates the minibus taxis. In Cape Town, then, they've introduced the My City. We've got these buses that are parked. There's about 80 of them that don't do anything at the moment. We've completed the dedicated lanes. We've done the cycle paths next to it. And at the moment, nothing is happening because there's an institutional deadlock about the terms in which these minibus taxis will be incorporated. And what has to happen is that they've got to agglomerate themselves and buy equity in these bus companies, and then agree to use the minibuses as feeder routes into the trunk system. So that's the rationale behind it. In Johannesburg, they've achieved that, and I'll say a bit more about that now. So in the first phase of this is what the system will look like in 20 years' time. They've basically built this component, that's what you've just seen, into the central business district. And then that's where the airport is, and then there's also a dedicated bus lane from the airport to the central business district. This is the phasing. So this will be phase 1. And there's an interesting politics to this, and I'll say it in a moment. This is phase 2, 2018 to 2020, 3 and 4. Now, this is where the wealthy in the city lives, and this is where poor people live. So politically, how they could have come to the conclusion that they have to introduce a system where there's suburban congestion for the middle classes is a really difficult question to answer, because this is where the pressure points are. This is just more illustrations of it to show that it's real. This is the pickup point at the airport. And the big joke at the moment is that these buses just transport the drivers of the buses. Nobody's using them because the connecting point in downtown doesn't have the feeder systems at the moment. What is significant, and not to create a skewed picture, the World Cup was a very important catalyst. So this is a revamp of the main train station. Cape Town is unique in South Africa. 55% of public transport trips are still done by train. So it's got a significant rail backbone. And they used the opportunity to dramatically upgrade the quality of that. This is when the fan mile, the stadium sits over here, if this picture would be complete. So from downtown, there was a fan mile to it. And it basically, in the psyche of Cape Town, the idea that you can close a road and make it dedicated for pedestrians was completely revolutionary. And it's fundamentally changed, I think, the psyche about that. And then, of course, similar to the Colombian experience, pedestrianization, taking roads back for pedestrians and so forth, using landscaping intelligently, and so forth and so forth. This is the idea in Cape Town, and I mentioned this already, so this is the proposal that they've got to form 2 companies. Very quickly on Johannesburg. This is what the system will look like in 15 years' time. The Johannesburg system is operational. This is downtown, this is Soweto. They've already built this component. They're busy constructing that arc at the moment, and the downtown part is complete. They managed to get this done before Cape Town for a whole number of reasons. And they're fairly certain that the first phase of the work will be concluded by 2013. This is just images of what the system looks like. Just the process of ripping the streets out and replacing them. And this is then what the stations look like. It's a pretty elegant design, kind of a caterpillar thing going on there. And then in downtown in Hillbrow, they've made a very interesting set of connections with reclaiming public space. Public art, this is a new social housing project that is partially private, partially publicly funded, and fundamentally changing the conception of how the inner city can be revitalized, and this is triggered by the investment in the BRT. Finally, then, the point that I just want to leave you with is that the challenges we have is not transport per se, but it is a whole series of interlinked urban investments that can fundamentally change the geography of access and equity in the city. So this is the boundary of Johannesburg as a metropolitan council. This is where the poor live. This is Soweto. This is Sandton, where the wealthy live. And essentially, what they are trying to do at the moment through something called the growth management strategy is to really become intelligent around how you reinforce the BRT system and network to basically only allow development on those corridors. And this shows capital investment. So every dot there is a capital project of the city, over R1 million. And what you can see from this is that they're increasingly trying to, through a prioritization system, crowd that in to only be in these spaces, right? Now, if this can be achieved, and part of the research that I'm doing at the moment is trying to understand the history of this and what's happening and the impact on the ground, but if this can be achieved, then I think we're getting close to thinking about the role public transport can play in democracy and facilitating access. The challenge is this, that in a country with a GDP per capita that's relatively high, but with a massive, massive proportion of the population with no access to income, how do you design interventions that can achieve this balancing act between accessibility, affordability, and access? And the BRT system is not affordable in South Africa. That's the tragic irony we're sitting with. And so the challenge we have is really to understand how do you do settlement reform so that we stop building for poor people at the outskirts, make them even poorer, link that to mobility reform, and understand that the fundamental preconditions for intervening in equitable land markets is the capacity to, in fact, begin to alter that through public investment and a whole set of other systems. And really, there's a kind of a design imperative in an institutional political sense that is about creating a fundamentally different discourse about the role of the city and the role of mobility and the role of access to not just what the city offers, but to what people want from the city. Thank you very much.
We'll take questions at the end of that, and thank you very much, Adrian.
Thanks, and good afternoon. We're changing gears a little bit here. I think I'm here to provide the local flavor and a bit of the contemporary local story for the symposium. And that's because there is a lot going on in New York, and there's a lot of discussion and debate going on about transportation and transportation policy and how we're using and how we're defining our streets these days. And specifically, you know, we're doing projects to try to speed up our bus system in the city. We have by far the country's largest bus system, but also, unfortunately, significantly the country's slowest bus system. We're doing a lot to improve safety in the city, and I'm going to talk more about the implications of that. Pedestrian fatalities are by far the highest share of people killed on our streets, and it's something, you know, we're very adamant about remedying. We're trying to make the city a place where you can choose in many places to ride a bicycle if you'd like to, without being, you know, an extreme sports person or an endurance athlete. And we're really trying to do a lot more with public space in the city and just really open and welcome people on our streets in a way that hasn't been done in quite a long time. And in thinking about this issue of democracy and mobility and the questions of who decides and who benefits, you know, I think there are a lot of different ways you can come at that in a variety of ways. And I think it's worth, in terms of really talking about the contemporary situation, to look back at the history of the city a little bit and think about some of the really big sort of tectonic shifts that have happened in the city's transportation and land use systems over the years. And I'm not going to go through every single one. But I think you can decide for yourselves, or maybe history will decide, whether this changes in our streetscape today, you know, really registers on the same scale as some of these things. And you know, the really big and probably most profound one was the construction of the subway system, you know, 100 plus years ago. And that involved both the private sector and government making some pretty, you know, some pretty fundamental decisions that imposed, you know, quite a bit of, you know, imposed a real physical change for a lot of people. And certainly, if you're in a developed part of the city, when the subways came through and were dug and buried and covered over, it was a major issue, and there was a lot of struggle around that. But one of the interesting flip sides of that is that because of the way the city was planned and the way the subway system was built out, it also really opened up a huge area for what was a amazingly overcrowded city at the time, and provided a lot more space for people to expand into, and really charted the growth of the city in a way, because a lot of the subways were built into what were essentially farmlands at the time. This is the northern tip of Manhattan in 1905 with the subway coming up. So there were, there's different ways to look at major improvements in access, but certainly a fairly top-down decision being made to do that. And there are a lot of these different major shifts in the city that you can point to. The development of the street grid in the 19th century was an imposition. It was a decision that was made, and not everybody was happy about it. And there have been some recent articles on its centenary talking about it. Streetcar removal in the mid-20th century was another one, and certainly a massive imposition was the development of the interstate and other limited access highway network. This is the construction of the Cross Bronx Expressway in the 50s, devastating to some neighborhoods, and this was true in not just the Bronx, but with other highway corridors as well. And there are famous books and other things that have charted the rise and fall of neighborhoods to the, the blighting effects of highway development coming through. That was certainly another decision that was made on high, and not even completely within the city, but the state and federal governments had a lot to do with that decision as well. Interestingly, this kind of very severe imposition triggered a lot of reaction, not just in the city here, but nationally as well. And there are a variety of famous freeway fights, some of which, there was a highway that would essentially have come right through this space that we're sitting in if the full plans had been built. So there were a lot of pieces on the tail end of the highway system that were essentially defeated, and there were even some other pieces of that sort of struggle at that time that resulted in Fifth Avenue no longer coming through Washington Square Park, to take another local example. So there's been a lot of tensions and pushes and pulls and different impacts from a variety of points of view of decision-making, accessibility, benefits to different sectors as we go in the city. And one of the, I think, least noticed and most unsung, I would say, probably because it's the least visible, certainly not in this sense, was the reconstruction of the transit system in New York. There was a process really after the city had hit a low point where city and state leaders and a variety of sectors in society, unions, business leaders, various public interest groups, came together and said, look, the city is not going to get back on its feet without rebuilding the transit system. And we've put $80 billion, in the neighborhood of $80 billion, into rebuilding the transit system in this region, most of it going into the subway system itself. And it's just really, the city of today that we're sitting and walking around in is just unthinkable if you, think back to the transit system of 1980. So it's another major transformation, huge public investment, and a huge benefit. The city lost 1 million people in the 1970s. Those people came back as the subway system was being rebuilt, and then another huge increment of people came in on their heels, to the point where we're now close to 8.4 million people, an historic high for New York City. So just having said that, I think that sort of sets the stage for where we are today. If you look at the city's population and economic growth in the last couple of decades and how that's been accommodated, it's really interesting to see that rebuilt transit system has absorbed almost all of that growth in terms of more people and more economic activity. We had sort of saturated ourselves with traffic. We're no longer really adding massive amounts of road capacity, and the transit system had a lot of slack because people had abandoned it to such a degree in the 1970s. So we've been charting these things recently in the last few years and putting out annual reports on how this is going. And this was one of the most striking findings in the first of our reports on transportation trends in the city, to show that the history of the city since the mid-1990s, early 1990s, is really sort of a massive demonstration of the principle of transit-oriented development. And city policy, which I'll get to in a little bit, has been really to try to reinforce this. and build on its strengths. And so where that leaves us is in a city that, for an American city, has a tremendous amount of choice and diversity in transportation. We are, very fundamentally a city of pedestrians, and that's thanks to that century of investment in public transit and the kind of density that it's afforded us to build. We did some surveys on pedestrian, on basically just walking in certain parts of the city. This may be hard to read for you. A few years ago, and I thought there was a very striking finding, was not that Broadway at Times Square had a similar number of pedestrians as Oxford Street in London, but down at the bottom of the chart was that East Fordham Road in the Bronx and then Flushing Main Street in Queens also had really world-beating pedestrian volumes compared to some of the other kinds of main streets, both in the city and around the world, that people had surveyed. And we're seeing that we're doing travel surveys in neighborhoods around the city now, and it's really interesting how you see a very consistent walking share for how people are arriving or taking local trips. Astoria in Queens is the same as Union Square and extremely bustling part of Manhattan from a walk point of view. And even, staying, in a pretty good neighborhood in that regard in further out places like New Dorp and Staten Island, and Fordham Road in the Bronx, even though you see in these two cases a real flip between car and bus usage. So it's very much a transit and walking city, and we reap huge benefits from this. We've had some analysis done looking at, essentially the idea that all the money that you would spend in a place that's very car dependent on cars and oil is just, you're just mainlining money out of your local economy because you aren't building cars or drilling or refining oil in much of in most American cities, certainly not here. But to the extent that you're saving money, you're putting money back into the point that Ricky made about transportation being work. We have a big workforce that not only runs the transit system, but keeps up, our massive street and highway system, runs a huge amount of it's a big industry in itself, and that's all local. The MTA Capital Program uses, very heavily New York State manufacturers, assemblers, equipment suppliers. So, there's a big economic piece to this that, to preserving this kind of choice and having had rebuilt our transit system and really preserved the advantages that we had from the density, which leads us to city policy today. And this, what are we trying to do now? And what it really is building on those strengths and sort of thinking about, well, we have density, we have public transit, we have huge amounts of people walking, but are we really accommodating that in the best way? Are we allowing for those strengths to further develop and help us work? And one of the things that, and it's not just about streets, and there's a lot of development planning and rezoning and thinking about future land use patterns and related to that, a very big effort to really open the city back to the waterfront, which it had turned its back on, during heavy industrial phase. But from the streets point of view, we have, the question is, do the streets accommodate those things that are our strengths in terms of being a pedestrian city, being a place with a very local retail economy where a lot of businesses depend on foot traffic, and the answer is it doesn't really, and we really have a street system that's kind of a vestige of a much earlier era. Probably the last major change that was made in our city streets was when we turned the major avenues in Manhattan from two-way to one-way. In 1952, you can see in Times Square both 7th Avenue and Broadway are still two-way streets. And that gave way over the next 10 years to a system of one-way avenues as we were trying to make further accommodation to the era of mass motoring and shoehorn even more and more cars into the city. And that really was the last major change you can point to in the city streetscape, 1950s, 1960s. And even then you can see that there is a sort of spatial tension between just vast numbers of people walking and a relatively small number of people driving. So, and it had very, very serious consequences just for safety and for quality of life in the city. We have nearly 3 million bus riders per day in the city, and they are not getting anywhere fast for the most part. And, there's just the issue of car-dominated streets are certainly crowding out other choices, and as I said, there's only a few people who are willing to do this, but it doesn't need to be the case. And the other thing some of our analyses have shown is that New York is largely a city without seats, and what that means for democracy, I'm not sure, but there's a long body of thought looking back at the Village Green or the Town Square as the meeting point of democracies, and places in public are as important to the polity and the public. And we have largely sort of built that out of New York City. So taking the last point first, we've been looking at where we can reclaim space and find it. And what's interesting here is that the business community has been a major partner in taking back parts of the city and rebuilding real public spaces. In 2008 along Broadway, we were able to take some lanes out where it's a fairly low volume, low traffic street, but huge numbers of people. And as soon as we put chairs out, people took it. Following on the success of that, much bigger project in 2009 to take Herald Square and essentially pedestrianize it, as well as Times Square. And those projects have been really successful. Simply simplifying the intersections at both Herald and Times Square has improved traffic flow on 6th Avenue. It's done no harm to 7th Avenue, which has had to take up a lot of the vehicles from Broadway. But far more foot traffic in those areas, more pleasant. Yesterday, the health department released numbers showing a tremendous improvement in air quality in these areas that are populated with hundreds of thousands of people per day. But it's not just a Manhattan thing. We've been working with groups on smaller projects all around the city, and we're doing it quickly and in ways that could be reversed if there was some disaster. There's no reason this will ever be reversed because it was hardly used before in Dumbo and Brooklyn. And in fact, these things are now entering the capital design phase, so they will be built out with more than just paint and big rocks. And we're getting a lot of applications to do more of these all around the city. Again, showing it is not just a central business district, but phenomenon, but really looking across some of the lower income parts of Brooklyn and the South Bronx as well to create more public spaces. And in some cases there is a nice effect where a local development corporation or merchants association is sort of bootstrapping itself by having to take over the maintenance of these new public spaces into business improvement districts and getting a little more assistance from both the city and philanthropic sectors who are interested in this kind of neighborhood development. Wherever we put out seats, people are taking it and using it almost immediately the day it opens in a variety of both residential and commercial settings. And it's clearly there's been a real undersupply of just space to be in the city rather than to sort of scurry from A to B. We've been doing new bus corridors. It's not the sort of Latin American full-blown massive boulevard two-way kind of BRT, but it's on this somewhere on the scale between local bus and BRT where we've introduced sidewalk fare payments so that and three-door buses so that people no longer have to sort of wait and do the dreadful thing with the Metro card that takes so long and ends up creating so much delay. And so interestingly, these new bus services, which are running east-west across the Bronx and up and down the east side of Manhattan, are seeing pretty significant increases in use and ridership, 30% in the Bronx case, close to 20% in Manhattan, at a time when bus ridership is actually falling citywide. I think what's really significant about that is not that we've improved a couple of bus routes, but really that we've developed a new model of service. And we've been able to do it across some of those lines that Ricky pointed to where the transit authority is not the same as the DOT, and we don't have that integrated Transport for London system, but there's good leadership in both agencies right now, and they've understood the benefits of working together and fulfilling that vision. And that model of new bus service now opens up a pipeline for an unlimited number of projects that can be built over time, and there is a bit of a master plan to help guide that development of that pipeline, looking at places that are underserved, places that could use better feeders to the subway, places that could simply open up and provide better service in a variety of directions again, that aren't served by the historical subway pattern of periphery to a central business district. Another network that's under a lot of development is the bicycle network. Looking at it a few years back, and now today, you can see it's really started to build out in some parts of the city, and you know, with a bit more gap filling, will be a pretty good citywide network. It's again, it's a long-term endeavor, but you have to start and build. And along with that rapid build out has come design innovation, so that we're not asking people just to protect themselves from, you know, fast-moving avenue traffic with a painted white line, but actually moving the parking away from the curb to create that sort of channel for bikes between the sidewalk and the curb. It's caused some conflict in the storefront sector, but we're, you know, doing a lot to preserve curbside access for loading and places where that's necessary. But we're seeing very good response rate from cyclists and a reduction in accidents in every case where we've implemented this kind of design. And in some places, they're really serving as great neighborhood recreational facilities as well as a piece of a transportation network. Again, just really increasing the choices available to people for what they do and how they live in cities. And you know, there's been some rhetoric. You know, all of these things are heavily criticized in some of the tabloid press and by some, you know, some of the elected officials around the city. And for some reason, cycling has been seen as an elitist thing to do and to accommodate. This is some cycle to work data from recent compilation of recent census reports. And I think what's interesting about it, the census is very ill-suited to counting cyclists because they only count journeys to work, and cycling is generally, which is you know, fewer than 20% of trips in the city to begin with. And cycling tends to be kind of an auxiliary mode for a lot of people, and they use it for non-work trips. And they often, you know, if you use it 2 times a week and you take the bus 3 times a week, you're counted as a bus commuter. But nonetheless, we're still seeing pockets in the census of census tracts with more than 5% of people riding bikes. And it's not, you know, just the sort of Park Slope kind of you know, stereotype, but it's people in southeastern Queens, it's people in southeastern Brooklyn, it's people in East Harlem, and it's people in the South Bronx, you know, all of whom have some difficulties with access to public transit. And in some of the other surveys that have been done, you know, around the city, city planning department found, you know, huge numbers of bikes parked along the number 7 train, which runs, you know, east-west across Queens in a place where there aren't too many other trains. So you're seeing, you know, there is a lot of accessibility that can be gained by allowing more people to ride bikes. The other thing about some of these new street designs is that they aren't just about bikes, but when you put the bike lane in against the curb, you dramatically reduce the space that a pedestrian needs to cross in terms of moving traffic. You create some refuge space where older people, disabled people, et cetera, can sort of make a multi-stage trip if they want. Oftentimes, and in places where we have a lot of seniors, it's a very simple intervention. It's just really just some concrete that needs to be added, but it can really improve the safety. And I think this issue of safety is something that, when we're talking about democracy and choice and sustainability, is really undersold, because if you really are thinking about public transit, you're thinking about pedestrians. If you're thinking about bikes as a feeder mode in, say, Bogota, people aren't going to use it if they're forced out into intimidating car traffic. They need the kind of bikeways that the Peñalosas implemented. And they need places that they feel safe and comfortable and attractive to walk. So street design, the design of the public realm becomes very important, but also really just focusing on traffic safety, traffic speeds, and whether street designs are promoting it or not promoting it. You know, a lot of Northern Europe has gotten this right, and we're still grappling with it in our country. But it is a very essential phenomenon, and there's sort of nothing less democratic than being crowded off a street, intimidated, or certainly injured or killed by traffic. And that's not just an issue here in the United States. It's a worldwide issue, and World Health has done some tremendous work in showing that it's becoming a pandemic, injuries related to motor traffic, and that most people in the world who are injured or killed by cars are not in cars. So we're doing not just street design, but you know, really starting to work on some cultural messages about why we're talking about this, what it means for real people. And we're seeing, despite the tabloid campaigns and people who claim that we're elitist, that both with their feet and at the level of public opinion, we're seeing a really good response to these kind of street design changes. Some of it's business, some of it's people using it, and some of it's public opinion. Thank you. Oh, we're doing that. Okay.
I mean, obviously, we know we're running a bit late, but I just thought before we move on to the next section, we might just pick up on a couple of the points that have made, and in case there are any direct questions you have from the floor or any of the other speakers to the two presentations. I mean, at one level, we might sit there and say we've just seen two presentations about very different subject, let alone different places. And I was struck by Edgar's use of the word "the right to the city," and the use of the concept of the imaginary, that in a way, behind the vision that was set by the founders of the new democracy in your city, in your cities, there was a series of very, very practical issues about public housing, about transport, and everything else. And I'd like to ask you, Edgar, to expand on that. Who were the players in that? But before you do that, John, if I ask you, what is the imaginary of New York City? You're sitting there in your department. I mean, there are a lot of technical parameters. There's a very clear sense from your presentation of where the city is going in terms of improvement to a whole series of, in many ways, unrecognizable compared to 20 years ago, unrecognizable sort of public intervention in the city. But in terms of who all this is for, and it's interesting to see you single out, even I from London have heard of the critique of the tabloids and the difficulty that Jeanette Siddiq-Khan is personally experiencing, if I understand it, from a particular newspaper, etc. Not surprising. We've gone through that with our Commissioner for Transport, or the Commissioner of Police, for example, in London. But say a little bit more about what you think the imaginary is, nearly in social terms. Who is this for in your city? And how do the newcomers to the city benefit from this? I'd just be interested, because you mentioned that the city is growing, but you didn't mention how the system supports that or doesn't.
Well, the concern is that it may not, and one of the origin points of the new policies is that the city has recovered from the low point of the 1970s, and instead of just rolling out the red carpet for whatever we can get, we've succeeded. We're back. You couldn't walk around without running into a construction site in 2005. So there was concern that we're not only been the historical city for immigration, in certainly now in the East Coast. We're seeing a huge amount of domestic migration to the city. It's a place people want to be, and we're seeing lower rates of out-migration because people are comfortable raising families and remaining here after they've come and done what they wanted to do as younger people. So it's really for all of those people, and it's for the places where we too have public housing that is not well connected, and so it's to find those places and better connect them.
And in connection with that, given that it's a city which is, so to speak, fully developed, but on the other hand with a series of major potential gaps for future development, I'm thinking of the ex-dock areas on the fringes of the city, etc.
Sure.
I was interested to see that, and this is probably because you were just responding rightly to my brief, but it was interesting that you didn't particularly talk about land use and development as part of the transport package. Now, in a way, Edgar has to, because the cities are growing, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. But first of all, a simple question: who is responsible for land use, development, and planning in the city, and how does that connect with your department?
Well, the city planning department is, and I mentioned some of the rezoning activity.
This is Amanda Burdett.
That's been going on, yes.
And
absolutely.
how do your transit plans, the cycle lanes, the diagrams you showed at the end, actually link up or not link up with potential major redevelopment sites? So let me, just to I saw a lot of those cycle lanes. I don't know your city as well as you all do. I didn't see them necessarily connect along the waterfront where I imagine there will be future development, but I may be just wrong. So,
No, they do. I mean, one of the most successful is on the Brooklyn waterfront
On
at
the
the
wa-
moment,
yeah.
which
That's
is another area that's a transportation challenge because it's very close to Manhattan. It's Manhattanizing in a way that it's growing up vertically. It's got much weaker subway links, so there are plans for ferry services there, but also the bikeway network has gone right through there and is hugely popular in those areas because of the difficult subway trips in and out of that area, but also because of the demographic of who's moved in there. So it's a very high sort of high usage area for both cyclists, pedestrians, and there I think there is room for rapid bus in there in the future as well.
Edgar, do you want to comment on?
Well, I'll respond to
Yeah.
your question. So when these policies were made, who were the players? Well, I think what one forgets about the normality, in the context of the normality of today, is that in '94, we were in the middle of a civil war. More people died in South Africa from political violence between 1990 and '94 than between 1960 and 1990. So, so we were this close to a really all-out civil war. So the transition was negotiated by the former apartheid regime, the liberation movements, and it was highly stylized. It was really, and the strategy was that it had to have a rights-based foundation. So the Constitution is extremely progressive. It was inflected by, I would say, a radical social democratic vision, which of course had a sort of a national socialist kind of garb, but at its core it was a radical social democratic agenda. The problem was that the material imaginary of that was informed by the white world of South Africa, which was extreme suburban living, as in a kind of Canadian North European context. And that informed the idea about what the achievement of rights would be. So what was missing at that time was a kind of cold engagement with what it means to have the vast majority of your population poor and structurally excluded from economic life, and with no prospect of that changing because of our educational system inheritance. And so what you had was a set of policies that emerged that were, as one practitioner colleague of mine calls it, Rolls-Royce policies, but the capability of the state and the resources of the state was the equivalent of a UNO. And this is the dilemma that we're dealing with, and that we don't have a mechanism in our political discourse or in the way interest gets framed to navigate this disjuncture. And so we continue with what seems politically the correct thing to do and in terms of a rights-based agenda, but actually there's a fundamental disconnect with what the society can afford, and nobody can have that conversation, and that's part of the difficulty.
I think one of the key issues which we need to come back to in the final discussion rather than continue now is the point that you made about density.
Yeah.
And you left it not even in the air hanging, but in a way you nearly said it's irreconcilable. The situation of having this low income, low density, because of course high income, low density is successful in the United States and everywhere else.